There are moments when prayer becomes silence, when certainty disappears, and when the soul that once felt guided suddenly finds itself abandoned in the dark. To many, this feels like failure. To the mystics, it could be the beginning of transformation. The dark night of the soul is terrifying because it asks a question no comfortable faith wants to answer. What remains of love when every sign of consolation is taken away? In this archive, we are going to follow that question into the deepest chambers of contemplative tradition. We are going to trace the teaching that named the darkness, mapped its stages, and dared to suggest that the soul's most terrifying season might also be its most sacred. This is not a simple story of suffering redeemed by eventual happiness. This is something older, stranger, and far more demanding than that. The wound at the center of this journey is one that countless spiritual seekers carry quietly and alone. They have prayed, they have waited, they have done everything that was asked of them. And then one day, the warmth disappeared, the sense of presence withdrew, and the silence that followed felt less like peace and more like desertion. They began to wonder, in the private dark of their own interior, whether they had been wrong about everything, whether God was absent, whether they had somehow failed. That wound is exactly where this teaching begins. Step with me now into a world shaped by candlelight and stone, by the slow rhythm of monastic bells and the long hours of interior prayer, by communities of men and women who gave their entire lives to the pursuit of something they could not see, taste, or measure, and who discovered in the depths of that pursuit that the spiritual life contained a darkness no one had fully prepared them for, a darkness that the great contemplatives would eventually come to understand not as the soul's defeat, but as the beginning of its most profound awakening. To understand why this teaching emerged with such force, we have to enter the world that produced it. In the contemplative traditions of medieval and early modern Christianity, the spiritual life was understood as a journey with stages. The soul began in devotion and discipline, moving through structured prayer, sacred ritual, and moral formation. The early stages were often filled with what the mystics called consolations, a word for that warm, luminous sense of divine presence that can flood the heart during prayer or worship, making God feel close, real, and immediately present. For many seekers, this was what the spiritual life felt like. It felt like warmth. But within those same traditions, among the more seasoned contemplatives, there circulated a knowledge that was rarely spoken aloud in ordinary religious life. The knowledge that consolation was not the destination, that the sweetness of early devotion was, in some sense, a beginning gift, something given to draw the soul forward, not something meant to remain forever unchanged. The monasteries and convents that devoted themselves to deep contemplative prayer became, over centuries, the laboratories of the interior life. And what they discovered there was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. The 16th century, in particular, was a time of immense spiritual hunger and institutional tension. The church was fracturing under the pressures of reform. Older contemplative traditions were being examined, questioned, and sometimes suppressed. In Spain, among a remarkable flowering of mystical life, men and women were pushing the boundaries of interior experience further than perhaps any generation before them. mapping the soul's journey with a precision and a vulnerability that would survive the centuries. It was in this world, under these pressures, and within these walls, that the most complete and searching account of spiritual darkness would be written. Beneath all the historical and institutional detail, something much older and more universal was being expressed. Human beings have always known that the inner life moves in seasons, that there are periods of light and warmth when meaning feels close and love feels easy, and there are periods of cold and silence when nothing the soul reaches for seems to answer back. Every tradition that takes the inner life seriously has had to reckon with this rhythm. The question has always been what it means and what the soul is meant to do when it arrives. The particular hunger that the contemplative tradition was trying to address was not simply the hunger for comfort. It was deeper than that. It was the hunger to understand whether love, real love that is not dependent on reward or feeling or immediate confirmation, was even possible for a human soul. Whether there was something in the human interior that could remain faithful, not because it was nourished by consolation, but because it had been changed at a level deeper than emotion, deeper than thought, deeper even than will. That question is not a theological abstraction. It is the question that anyone who has loved through loss, remained through silence, or waited in the dark without assurance has already begun to ask. The official story that most ordinary religious life told about spiritual darkness was relatively simple and not entirely wrong, but it was incomplete. Darkness, in the ordinary framework, was usually understood as the result of sin, weakness, distraction, or spiritual neglect. If you felt distant from God, the common answer was that you needed to pray more faithfully, confess more honestly, discipline yourself more rigorously. The prescription was always more effort, more observance, more devotion. Darkness was a problem to be solved, and the solution was always something the believer was expected to produce. What the deeper contemplative tradition began to suggest, quietly at first and then with increasing clarity, was something that disturbed this familiar framework at its roots. It suggested that there was a kind of darkness that came not from the soul's failure, but from its progress. That there was a season of interior night that arrived not because the seeker had turned away from God, but because something in the relationship was being transformed beyond what early devotion could contain. That the disappearance of consolation was not punishment. That it could, in certain circumstances, be a form of invitation, strange, painful, and entirely unlike anything the soul had been prepared to receive. The figure who gave this experience its most enduring name and its most precise map was a Spanish mystic of the 16th century, a Carmelite friar and poet named Juan de Yepes Alvarez, who is known to history as John of the Cross. He was born in 1542 in the Castilian town of Fontiveros, the son of a family of modest means. And from his earliest years, he seemed drawn toward the interior life with an intensity that marked him as someone for whom the outer world was always in some sense a veil over a deeper and more demanding reality. He entered the Carmelite order as a young man, eventually encountering the great reforming mystic Teresa of Avila, whose vision of contemplative life would become the context for everything he wrote. John of the Cross was not primarily a theologian in the academic sense. He was a poet first and a spiritual director second. And what he produced in his relatively short life, he died at 49, was a body of writing that remains, after more than 4 centuries, the most searching and precise account of the soul's journey through darkness that Western contemplative tradition has ever produced. His 2 great prose works, The Ascent of Mount Carmel and The Dark Night of the Soul, were written as commentaries on a single poem he had composed, remarkably, during a period of extreme suffering, while he was held as a prisoner in a dark, airless cell by members of his own order who opposed the reforms he had helped to introduce. The poem that would become the foundation of everything begins with a soul slipping out of a darkened house in the middle of the night, moving in secret, without light, guided only by something burning quietly in its own interior. It is a poem of absence and presence simultaneously, of darkness that is somehow also a kind of fire, of a journey made not by certainty, but by love, and by love alone. In those brief lines, John of the Cross captured something that centuries of mystical experience had been reaching toward, but had never expressed with quite that combination of precision and beauty. He gave the darkness a name, and in naming it, he transformed it. The first and perhaps most important revelation of John's teaching is that the dark night is not what it appears to be from the inside. From within the experience, it feels like loss, like abandonment, like the withdrawal of everything that once gave the spiritual life its warmth and its meaning. The person undergoing it typically cannot pray in the ways that once sustained them. They find no consolation in the practices and devotions that once felt alive. The sense of God's presence, once so reliable, has become entirely absent. And because this feels so total, so inexplicable, and so unlike anything they were taught to expect, most people in the middle of it conclude that something has gone terribly wrong. But what John of the Cross proposes, drawing on a tradition of contemplative observation that extended back through centuries of monastic experience, is that what is actually happening in the dark night is a work of stripping, not of punishment. The soul is being freed from attachments it did not know it had. Attachments not only to pleasure and comfort in the ordinary sense, but to spiritual consolation itself, to the feeling of God's presence, to the reward of devotion, to the image of God that the soul has constructed and clung to in ways it has never been forced to examine. The darkness does not come because the soul is rejected. It comes in this understanding because the soul is being loved at a depth that its existing forms cannot contain. What makes this teaching genuinely extraordinary, and what distinguishes it from ordinary religious consolation or moral instruction, is precisely its refusal to offer easy comfort. John of the Cross does not tell the suffering soul that the darkness will soon pass, that if it simply remains faithful, the warmth will return, that God is testing it and will soon reward its patience. He does not reduce the dark night to a temporary difficulty to be endured on the way to something more pleasant. He insists, with a seriousness that can feel almost severe, that the soul in the dark night must not try to escape it, must not artificially generate feelings of consolation, must not force the return of what has been taken away. The teaching is not about endurance in the ordinary sense. It is about a particular quality of surrender, the willingness to remain in the dark without knowing when or whether the light will return in the forms the soul recognizes, the willingness to release the image of God that consolation had built and to wait without possession in the open space that the loss has created. This is not a teaching for the faint-hearted, and John of the Cross knew it. It asks of the human soul something that very few spiritual traditions have had the courage to name directly: the possibility that love, at its deepest level, must ultimately be freed from every form of spiritual possession, even the possession of God's felt presence. The tension that surrounds John of the Cross and his teaching is not a simple story of persecution by ignorant authorities. It is something more nuanced and in some ways more instructive. The Carmelite order was in the midst of a painful internal division between those who supported the reform movement championed by Teresa of Avila and John himself, sometimes called the Discalced Carmelites, and those who opposed it, who saw the reform as disruptive and its leaders as dangerously presumptuous. In 1577, John was seized by members of the opposing faction and imprisoned in a small cell in Toledo for more than 8 months. The conditions were genuinely harsh. The cell was barely large enough to stand in. He received almost no light, very little food, and was brought out periodically to be publicly humiliated and physically punished. It was in that cell, in conditions of almost total deprivation, that John of the Cross composed the poem that would become the foundation of all his prose writing. He held the verses in his memory, having nothing to write on, and when he eventually escaped through a window he had managed to loosen, he brought those lines with him intact. The irony is both historical and spiritual. The man who would give the world its most precise map of interior darkness composed his foundational text inside a darkness that was not metaphorical at all. The cell, the hunger, the silence, and the humiliation were the literal environment in which the poem about the soul's secret journey through the night was born. What this tells us is something important about the nature of the teaching itself. The dark night, as John experienced it, was not a concept developed in comfortable theological study. It was a truth discovered in extreme circumstances, tested against real suffering, and refined in the kind of silence that is not chosen but imposed. And when the institutional powers of his own tradition tried to suppress what he represented, they did not destroy it. They deepened it. They gave it a biographical weight that no purely academic mysticism could possess. His imprisonment did not contradict his teaching. In a profound and unsettling way, it confirmed it. The teaching of the dark night was felt as threatening by ordinary religious imagination for reasons that were not entirely unreasonable. At the heart of the religious contract, as most people understood it, was something like a logic of spiritual reward. You pray faithfully, you observe the commandments, you participate in the sacraments, and in return you receive God's grace, felt as warmth, assurance, consolation, and the quiet certainty that you are loved and guided. This is not a cynical or corrupt framework. It is a very human one, and it serves genuine spiritual needs, especially in the early stages of the interior life. But John of the Cross was teaching something that moved beyond this framework entirely, and that movement could feel, from within the familiar structure, like a kind of spiritual anarchism. If the dark night is not a sign of failure, if the withdrawal of consolation is not punishment, if the soul is meant to continue loving in the absence of every felt confirmation of that love, then the entire logic of spiritual reward is placed in question. God cannot be approached as a guarantor of inner warmth. Prayer cannot be understood primarily as a method for generating holy feeling. The soul cannot assess its own spiritual health by the presence or absence of consolation. These were not comfortable conclusions. They disturbed both the pious and the institutional, because they implied that the deepest relationship with God lay entirely beyond the territory that ordinary religious observance could control or confirm. Before we go deeper, I want to ask you something. When silence enters your inner life, when prayer feels hollow and the sense of presence withdraws, does it feel like absence to you, like something has gone wrong? Or does some quieter part of you wonder whether the silence itself might be a form of purification, something working in you at a depth you cannot yet see? Leave your reflection in the comments. It becomes part of the archive. 4.4. The Descent Beneath the Surface. And so we descend now beneath the surface of history and biography, beneath the cell in Toledo and the reform of Carmel, beneath the theological controversies and the institutional conflicts, into the interior territory itself, into the stages of the night, as John of the Cross described them, the precise and demanding cartography of what happens when the soul is stripped of its familiar spiritual supports and left to move through darkness, guided by nothing it can identify as light. John of the Cross describes the dark night not as a single undifferentiated experience, but as a journey with identifiable stages, each more demanding and more transformative than the last. He speaks of two great movements, which he calls the night of the senses and the night of the spirit. The first is more common. In it, the soul finds that its sensory and emotional experience of God, the warmth of prayer, the sweetness of devotion, the felt sense of divine closeness, begins to dry up. What once felt alive and nourishing in the spiritual life becomes arid and flat. The soul, he suggests, is being weaned from spiritual pleasure as a child is weaned from milk, not because pleasure was wrong, but because the soul is being called to a different kind of sustenance. The second movement, the night of the spirit, is rarer and more severe. This is where the deepest structures of the soul's relationship with God, its theological certainties, its images, its most fundamental spiritual frameworks are brought into darkness. This is not intellectual doubt in the ordinary sense, though it may feel like it. It is something the contemplative tradition understood as a purification of the faculties themselves, of memory, understanding, and will, the very instruments by which the soul reaches toward God. In this stage, even the consolation of spiritual ideas begins to fail. The soul cannot think its way through the darkness. It cannot feel its way through it. It can only move through it by a faith that has been stripped of every support except itself. What John teaches is that in both stages, the soul's task is not to produce a way out, but to remain in a specific disposition that he describes as loving attention, a patient, open, non-grasping receptivity that neither forces the experience nor flees from it. He is precise about what the soul in the dark night should not do. It should not try to return to its former modes of prayer by force. It should not manufacture consolation. It should not interpret its aridity as certain evidence of God's disapproval. What it should do is remain quietly and without demand in the open darkness, trusting that what is happening is a work being done in the soul rather than a punishment being imposed upon it. This, he acknowledges, is among the most difficult things a human soul can be asked to do. The image of night that runs through all of John's writing is not a simple metaphor for suffering. It is a richly layered symbol that carries multiple meanings simultaneously, and understanding those layers is essential to understanding the depth of what he was teaching. Night, in his imagery, is first of all a womb. It is the dark interior space in which something new is being formed that does not yet have the shape to be visible. The soul in the dark night is not dying. It is gestating. Something is being prepared inside it that cannot be hurried or forced into the light before its time. And the darkness is not the enemy of that process. It is its necessary environment. Night is also a tomb, and here the symbolism grows more demanding. Something in the soul must die in the dark night, something real, not merely symbolic in a comfortable sense. The self that was organized around spiritual consolation, around the reward-based logic of religious experience, around the image of God that devotion had constructed and clung to, must be relinquished. This is genuinely a form of death, an inner death, the death of a particular relationship with the divine that must be surrendered before a deeper one can begin. John does not soften this. He knows that for the soul in the middle of it, it does not feel like transformation. It feels like loss, and it is loss, though what is lost is precisely what needed to be released. Night is also a desert and a threshold. The desert appears in the great mystical and prophetic traditions as the place where God speaks most clearly, where the ordinary supports of life are stripped away and the soul is left with nothing to rely on except the most essential. And a threshold is a liminal space, a place of crossing, where what was cannot continue and what will be has not yet arrived. The soul in the dark night stands at that threshold, suspended between the spiritual life it knew and the one it has not yet entered, in a space that is genuinely neither here nor there. That suspension is not comfortable, but in the contemplative reading, it is precisely where the transformation occurs. Here is where the teaching takes its most unexpected and perhaps its most important turn. John of the Cross does not describe the dark night as a period in which God is absent. He describes it as a period in which God is present in a way the soul cannot recognize because it is accustomed only to the forms of presence that consolation provides. The darkness, in his understanding, is not empty. It is full of a love so pure and so intense that the soul, which is still organized around a lesser capacity for receiving, cannot perceive it without being overwhelmed and appearing to itself to be in darkness. It is a little like trying to look directly at the sun. The excess of light produces what the eye experiences as blindness. This hidden turn reaches toward the viewer's own interior life in a way that deserves to be held quietly rather than resolved quickly. There are seasons of the inner life that feel like abandonment, and in those seasons, the most natural response is to search for an explanation, to diagnose the silence as evidence of something broken, something failed, something that needs to be fixed. What John of the Cross asks us to consider is another possibility entirely, that some silences are not empty, that some forms of darkness carry within them a hidden work, and that the soul's inability to feel or measure what is happening does not mean that nothing is happening. The question is whether the soul can learn to remain in the not knowing without fleeing into counterfeit light. For those contemplatives who encountered this teaching and recognized in it the map of their own experience, the effect was not simply intellectual understanding, it was something closer to the relief of a traveler who has been lost in unmapped territory and suddenly sees in a stranger's hand a chart of exactly the terrain they have been wandering. The dark night, as a named and charted reality, gave those who were suffering it a framework within which to remain rather than flee. It told them that what they were experiencing was not unprecedented, not a sign of unique failure, not a symptom of spiritual disease. It was a passage, a known passage, one that had been walked before and survived. This does not mean the teaching made the experience easy. The mystics who worked within John of the Cross's framework were careful to say that naming the dark night does not shorten it or soften its demands. But there is a profound difference between suffering in a darkness you believe to be meaningless and suffering in a darkness you have been given reason to understand as purposeful. The seekers who took this teaching seriously did not become passive or resigned. They became, over time, capable of a quality of love and a depth of inner freedom that the contemplative tradition regarded as among the most precious things a human soul could achieve. The soul before the dark night is not a lesser soul. It is a soul in an early, genuine, and often beautiful stage of relationship with the divine. It prays with warmth. It finds consolation in devotion. It feels the presence of God as something close and sustaining. This is real. It is not illusion or pretense, but there is in this stage something that John of the Cross describes with great gentleness as impurity, not in a moral sense, but in the sense of mixture. The love of God is real, but it is mixed with the love of the feeling of God's presence. The desire for union is genuine, but it is entangled with the desire for the consolation that union brings. The faith is true, but it leans on confirmation. And all of this, he suggests, is natural and forgivable and even necessary in the early stages. It is simply not the final form. After the dark night, or more precisely through it, something in the soul's relationship with God is reorganized at a fundamental level. What emerges is a love that does not depend on feeling its own warmth to remain real, a faith that does not require continuous confirmation to remain faithful, a capacity for presence that is no longer contingent on the presence being perceptible. The soul that has passed through the dark night is not a soul that no longer desires God. It is a soul that has been freed from the particular form of desire that required God to present himself in ways the soul could recognize and measure. It loves differently, more simply, more vulnerably, and more deeply. The difference between these two conditions is not a difference of moral achievement. It is a difference of interior structure. The soul, before the dark night, is organized around its own spiritual experience. The soul, after it is organized, in this tradition's understanding, around something closer to the naked reality of God beyond all the soul's projections and images of God. This is why John of the Cross calls what the soul arrives at, eventually and incompletely and always as gift rather than achievement, a union of love, not a union built by effort or sustained by feeling, but one that survives in the dark and remains real precisely because it has learned to exist without possession. The dark night of the soul speaks to the modern world with a peculiar and unexpected intensity, not because the modern world is full of contemplative mystics, but because the modern world is full of people who have experienced precisely what the dark night describes and have had no framework within which to understand it. The language of contemporary life tends to interpret interior darkness almost exclusively in pathological terms. Burnout, depression, anxiety, spiritual emptiness, the collapse of meaning. These are real experiences, and they have real medical and psychological dimensions that should never be minimized. But they are not only pathological, and for many people, the purely clinical framework, however valuable, does not fully reach what they are living through. There is something in the dark night tradition that speaks to a different layer of these modern experiences, a layer beneath the diagnosis, where the question being asked is not only what is wrong with me, but also what is this doing to me? What am I being asked to release? What in me is being remade in a darkness I cannot control or explain? People who have lost faith that once sustained them. People who have worked for years at something that no longer nourishes them. People who have reached the outer limit of every strategy for producing meaning and found only silence on the other side. These are people who may find in the dark night tradition not a cure, but a companion. Not an answer, but a map of territory that someone has walked before them. The phrase, dark night of the soul, has traveled far beyond the world of Carmelite mysticism. It has entered literature, psychology, poetry, and popular culture in ways that John of the Cross could not have anticipated, and that sometimes carry the phrase quite far from its contemplative roots. Psychologists have used it to describe periods of psychological crisis and transformation. Poets have used it as a metaphor for any season of profound inner darkness. Contemporary spiritual writers have adapted it to address everything from grief to career crisis to the dissolution of religious identity. In each of these uses, something of the original teaching survives, even when the theological framework has been stripped away. What survived most durably was the central intuition that darkness can be purposeful, that the inner life has seasons of stripping that are not simply pathological, and that what a person loses in a period of profound interior darkness is not always what they most needed to keep. That intuition, which John of the Cross articulated with such precision within a specifically Christian mystical framework, has proven capable of traveling across traditions and contexts in ways that suggest it touches something genuinely fundamental about the structure of the human interior. It has been recognized in the writings of Buddhist contemplatives, in the poetry of Sufi mystics, in the journals of secular philosophers, and in the testimonies of ordinary people who have never read a word of Spanish mysticism, but who know from the inside exactly what the dark night means. We have traveled a long way through this archive. We began in a prison cell in Toledo, where a man held the lines of a poem in his memory because he had nothing to write on and everything to express. We moved through the contemplative tradition that produced him, through the age that needed what he had discovered, and through the inner cartography of a darkness that turns out to be neither empty nor punishing, but full of a hidden and demanding love. We have stood at the threshold between the soul that needs consolation and the soul that has learned to love without it. And we have watched that teaching survive centuries, cross traditions, and arrive intact in a world very different from the one in which it was born. What remains now, after all that distance, is something simpler and more intimate than any of the theology or the history. It is the image of a soul in the dark, no longer certain of anything, unable to feel its way forward, and yet not turning back. Not because it is brave or strong or spiritually advanced, but because something in it, something beneath feeling and beneath thought and beneath the desire for confirmation, is still oriented toward a light it cannot see. That orientation, quiet and stubborn and entirely vulnerable, is what John of the Cross spent his life trying to describe. And it is the most honest portrait of the contemplative life that any tradition has ever produced. And so we return, at last, to the question we opened with. What remains of love when every sign of consolation is taken away? John of the Cross spent his life proposing an answer, and the answer is not comfortable and not complete, and not the kind that resolves the question and makes it possible to move on without carrying it further. What remains, he suggested, is precisely what the consolation had always been pointing toward, but could never fully reveal. A love that is not produced by warmth, not confirmed by feeling, and not sustained by the soul's own sense of being loved, but that exists at a level deeper than any of these, in the part of the human interior that does not require proof in order to remain oriented towards the source of its own being. What the dark night ultimately reveals is not a technique for surviving spiritual difficulty. It is a question about what in the human soul is capable of loving without possession. Every consolation, every warm feeling of divine presence, every moment when prayer feels alive and God feels close, is in some sense a form of spiritual possession, not in a corrupt way, but in the simple sense that the soul holds it, enjoys it, and would choose to keep it. The dark night removes that possession, not cruelly, but carefully, because what lies beneath possession, if the soul can bear to remain in its absence long enough, is something the mystics considered the most essential and most vulnerable thing in the human interior, the capacity to love what cannot be held. If this archive speaks to the part of you that still searches through the silence, subscribe and return. There are more manuscripts to open, more forgotten voices waiting to be heard, more maps of the inner life that history buried but could not destroy. The archive remains open for those who are willing to read in the dark. We began in the dark with a question about what remains when consolation is taken away. We end in the dark as well, but it is a different dark now. It is not the dark of abandonment or confusion or the failure of faith. It is the dark of the womb, the dark of the threshold, the dark of the poem composed in a cell by a man who had lost everything except the lines that were forming in him. It is the dark that John of the Cross looked into and did not flinch from, and that he mapped with such precision and such love that 4.5 centuries later, it still reads like a letter addressed to whoever finds themselves in the middle of the night, wondering if the darkness has meaning. The soul that enters the dark night intact and emerges from it, if it emerges, is not the same soul. Something has been simplified in it, something stripped down to what it most essentially is. And what it most essentially is, in the deepest contemplative reading, is not a seeker of consolation, but a capacity for love, a capacity that the darkness did not destroy but only at last revealed. The archive closes here, but the night and what it carries remains open.